Roberts, and I'm the Dean of Design here. I have 900 students in my division and 10 programs. I'm also delighted to note that my fantastic colleague, Jonathan Massey, who's the Dean of Architecture, is in the house with us. Jonathan has joined us in the past year from Syracuse University. He is leading a really interesting architecture program that I suggest everybody look at, where they are doing fantastic work around speculative design. One of the groups is called Future Cities Lab, and if you went up on the tour, you met Jason Kelly Johnson, so I highly recommend that. In the design division, as I said, we have 10 programs. We have long and deep roots in what's called transdisciplinary design. For over a decade, we have been working in that space, and we are seeing really interesting relationships emerging in our classrooms across design disciplines. And I encourage everybody who's here to reach out to me if you're interested in coming by and talking to a class, teaching a class, sponsoring a class, working with our college. We are very interested in exposing our students to design in practice outside the classroom. So I would look forward to that conversation. With that, welcome again. And our panel is going to be talking about speculative futures across several different towers. I'm delighted to share the stage today with Bob Baxley, who is the Director of Design at Pinterest. Prior to that, he was at Apple, where he was the Director of Design for the Apple Online Store experience. He's also the author of a book entitled Making the Web Work. Bob, welcome. Yeah. We also have Emiliano Horcada.
Good.
Thank you. I practiced during the break. And Emmy is the head of design for Globant and has flown up from Argentina to join us. So yes, and you're looking very fresh and not tired. That's great. So we've had one chance to kind of gather by phone and talk a little bit about this. We're not showing slides. We decided that we wanted this to be a conversation, and we very much want this to be an interactive conversation, using the term interactive not in a digital way. So I am going to be watching carefully for hands going up, and when you have a comment or a question you'd like to ask, jump in. We really want to have this dialogue with you. So with that, we're going to start by wading into the future of the web. So we were talking about how we see things shifting from a machine or digitally curated, an algorithm curated web to a human curated web. Bob, did you want to speak to that a little bit?
Thanks for having me today. Hope everybody's enjoying the weather. Usually it's better, so I apologize. And welcome to Halloween in San Francisco. I hope all of you get out before the craziness tomorrow. Because Saturday, Halloween in San Francisco is a thing to behold. So that's a big question. Maybe a way to get into it is to start thinking about the split between what's happening with Google's vision of the web and Apple's vision of the internet, if you will. So on the Apple side, you've really got a move towards individual apps on your phone, and the apps are containing more and more content that are locked up in the apps themselves. And you see that in Instagram and Flickr and Facebook and Twitter and to a lesser degree Pinterest. But like there's more and more things that are available on the internet that aren't accessible to Google and other crawling search engines. Google, on the other hand, obviously is pressing for a much more public web where they can get access to all the world's information so they can organize it and give you quick access to it. What we see in user behavior is that there's a group of questions you might have or ways that you're interacting with data where you're looking for an objective answer to a question. When does my flight arrive? What's the currency exchange? What time does that movie start? And a service like Google is fantastic for that. If there is a single objective answer that you need to get to, Google is far and away the most amazing piece of billions of lines of code that will ever do that. On the other side of the spectrum, though, there are much more subjective questions. What should I have for dinner? What would be a great Halloween costume? What should I get my wife for her birthday? Questions that I'm dealing with even today. And a service like Pinterest is actually a much better environment to answer those sorts of subjective questions. So if you were to go to Pinterest and do a search for Halloween cookies or Pinewood Derby cars or romantic gifts, you're going to get a much better selection of things to look at and to evaluate visually. And again, those are subjective questions. Pinterest isn't going to give you the single answer. It's going to give you a range of options, and the way those options are calculated is based on human behavior, as opposed to as opposed to Google, where it's based on a known algorithm that Google controls and actually manipulates on a quite regular basis, and forces everybody else on the open web to sort of respond really quickly. So I do think what we're seeing is sort of this, again, the split at one level between the open web that we've thought about for the last 10 years and a move towards apps, where more and more data is trapped in the apps. I think that's one layer of where the web is headed. And then also this difference between objective, answerable questions versus subjective suggestions, if you will.
So one thing to add to that is that I think one of the great things about human-curated content or human-curated even applications and even all the services that we have is that when we design products and services such as Pinterest that allows communities to rise and nurture each other in any way, I think that's certainly the future. I think that technology today is allowing us to use technology in a more humane way. And I think that when we design and we will help our clients and we will help ourselves to create products and services that drive from that basic human behavior, that's when we start realizing that these products are well made and that we use it every day and we use it in our daily routines because they enhance our very human behavior. And that's a thing that we as designers, as engineers, as makers, we need to be very aware of.
Yeah, there's something very real and that touches you really deeply when you're using a service that's connected to another human being. I recently had an experience where I was in a hospital with my mother for a few days in Dallas, and to sort of pass the time, I ended up playing a lot of chess because it was just a way to pass the time. And there's sort of two apps on my phone. There's one called Social Chess, and there's another called Play Magnus. So Play Magnus, you're playing against an algorithm, and Social Chess, you're playing against other people. And when you're playing against other people, they make a move every few hours, every few days. But it was so much more gratifying actually losing, because I lost to both of them, but it was so much more gratifying losing to people, because you just knew that there was some other person on the other end. The chess experience itself, it's a very structured game. You know, it's pretty much the same thing, except for maybe the timing differences, but it was just so much more meaningful to play against a person.
I'm looking forward, though. I don't know if today when we're talking about big data and artificial intelligence, and we were talking about that it's going to become extremely smart. I'm wondering, though, if at some point is going to be able to mimic our human behavior in that way in a way fool us that we're playing with another human, you know, and how is going to be our response to that algorithm in a way, you know, and I'm wondering how that's going to change even the way that we design, if we're considering these behaviors as exclusively human, or if we're going to consider that just as the default behavior of any system in general. I'm hopeful to think that that's going to be positive, but still wondering how that interaction is going to be, right? And how it's going to feel more.
Well, I think that's an interesting point, and I think it was pretty well captured in that film Her, where the challenge was the revelation of what was going on there. But then our earlier panel today, where Jana was talking about AI and that hockey stick path run, so that we're going from Siri behaving at the level of a chimp to being Einstein very, very, very quickly, and we have to all be sort of ready for that and participate in that. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
No, go ahead.
We're going to avoid that question for a second.
No.
I don't know. I mean, it still feels a little bit like science fiction, doesn't it? In some way, even though it's so here. I just go back to the point that if all of those tools are going to be available, and most of them are available today, thinking that our discipline is the holy grail of anything is just wrong. We just need to open our whole collaborative process to include the things that look like from another world. So in terms of design, just thinking about interfaces, it's not enough. We need to think very deeply about behavior and habits and how to create a habit And maybe artificial intelligence is going to be an enabler or an enhancer of certain things. But certainly, if it's something so out there, it's something that feels like science fiction, I think that the only solution to maybe adopting this is adopting it early and test it and see how it works and help it build in a good way, and don't just leave it alone and see, well, when it evolved, I'm gonna deal with it. No, I think that today was talking about, okay, get to it now and see how it's going to evolve so you're very used to it. And I think that's crucial. I think that we have to be early adopters in seeing how this changes the way that we work and how it changes the way that we collaborate with one another.
Yeah, I have to admit, I'm a little nervous about all this stuff. I have a couple of kids in high school, and when you start looking at the world from a point of view of a teenager, the future's not all that great, really. When I grew up, there was a couple of old guys that supposedly had access to a red button that would drop nuclear weapons, and that was sort of the big threat, but you sort of believed that at the end of the day they wouldn't actually hit that red button. But my kids grew up in a world that the news every day is just like this tragic stuff, and nobody's in charge, right? So whether it's civil wars and refugees around the world, or it's global warming, like climate change, like there's nobody in charge. I was driving my son somewhere last night, and we were listening to the news for 10 minutes, and he just turned it off. He's like, God, it's just so depressing, which is kind of tough coming from a 17-year-old. And so one of the things I was reflecting on is that I've never seen a movie about the future where there's any stand-up comedy. Like, whenever you watch movies about the future, they're just so freaking dystopian. It's just sad, like all of them. I've put that meme out there a couple of times on Twitter. Nobody can come back with somebody who has a positive view of the future from a science fiction perspective. So I'm nervous because one of the things that makes me nervous is we don't have nearly enough designers entering the field. One of the stats I throw around is the U.S. economy is poised to consume 1.4 million software engineers in the next 4 years. Working at a company like Pinterest, I can tell you we need at least a 10-to-1 ratio between engineering and design. So that means the U.S. economy could consume as many as 140,000 software engineers in the next 4 years at a minimum. There's not 140,000 software engineers alive working today, or software designers, sorry, are alive and working today, and there's nowhere close to that number of schools graduating people. And it turns out all those engineers, they're going to write code, and they're going to do all sorts of stuff, and there's not going to be somebody in the middle to mediate that relationship between the humans and the technology, and that does sort of make me nervous, because I think we're living in an era right now where if you think about there being sort of a struggle of control between humans and machines, I suspect many of you go through the day thinking the machines might be winning. And I don't know how the humans start winning unless we get a lot more humans involved thinking about that relationship. And I haven't seen a lot of urgency around that. Certainly in the US, there's a lot of pressure around STEM education, and we're teaching lots of people engineering and math. We're not teaching people so much history and art, and there's not really much design in any of the schools, and there's not an understanding yet of the economic benefits at the individual level, specifically of being a designer.
That's very provocative. I bet there's somebody who might want to comment on what Bob just said. Anybody feeling inspired to jump in here to counteract the dystopian reality that Bob is playing out for us?
Please counteract the dystopian reality.
All right, we'll keep. Yeah.
So I work in high-tech PR, and I think that. Can you give her the microphone? Yeah, I can yell if you want. So I work in high-tech PR, and I have a couple of clients that are focused on sort of the STEM conversation, and they are actually changing it to STEAM to incorporate arts into that, because design is so much, integrated into the user experience of functional technology, and if it doesn't function, you're not going to have users. So I think that it is wrong to separate those things, and I think that we need to look at it holistically, and that's sort of the problem of technology is we love to segment and compartmentalize, and I think that's where we get into issues with security and other things that are added as an afterthought rather than looking at a holistic approach. So finding ways to integrate the arts back into it, I think, is so important.
Yeah, the STEAM stuff is something that John Maeda, who's now at Kleiner Perkins, has been championing a lot. And it's great. We finally got a letter in there, but we got 1 out of 5. So it's we could use a few more. it's sort of happening at the schools. You don't see it so much with the coding academies and whatnot, but there's definitely an understanding, and as people interact with technology more, I think they're understanding more the need for design. I know very few people who understand what UI design is. I was looking at some article yesterday or a couple days ago, and it was talking about what professions does your mother not understand, and I think UI design was number one on the list. 99% of moms have no idea what UI design is. I've been doing it for 25 years. My parents still haven't a clue of what the profession really is. So I think we've got a ways to go, but I think you're right that people are starting to figure some of it out.
But isn't that the goal of it anyway? You shouldn't really know what UI design is because it's done right.
Well, no. The problem is people don't realize it's a profession. They don't realize they don't realize it pays as well as engineering. So if you're sitting at a high school today and you're in the career counseling center, you're surrounded by a bunch of parents who are incredibly frightened about their children's future, and so they push them into science and engineering and math because it's objective and the path is known. If you get these numbers, then that means you can go to those schools, which means you get those numbers on your paycheck. And design still seems like a bunch of the weird kids hanging out in the corner, right? And they don't realize that the designers are actually on the same pay scales as the engineers, and they're in more demand. And I can tell you that because I hire a bunch of them, and I'm sort of flabbergasted at what they make. But it turns out, it's an incredibly leveraged skill. Again, if you just take that baseline ratio, 1 designer to 10 engineers, that's the very definition of leverage. So a great designer, has a huge impact on a company, and I think parents are just starting to connect that economic reality and be okay with their kids going into art school and design school.
And I think that's huge. I think that the generation of us designers becoming parents are gonna be hugely influential on that. But I think one of the key things is that, I don't know if you feel the same, but sometimes designers are still seen as you're talented, and everything that you do is because you were born talented. And the truth is that there's a huge, we have to push for a vision of design of professionalism, of skills that require professional skills, a skill set. And we have to show in our practice that design is not exclusively about talent, it's about practice. And I think that is going to change radically. I think there's a hand there.
Mike back there.
Oh, sorry, the mic is there.
I agree we need more designers, but I also feel like we need to push more design thinking into other areas. So we need more engineers who think about service design and user experience, and we need more scientists who think about the impact of their discoveries and who's using them. And so it becomes much more than just the vaulted designer in his ivory tower or making proclamations, but it's really the responsibility of everybody to think about how the things we create are being used.
Yeah, so having spent 8 years of my life at Apple, I can tell you that's what makes Apple distinct from every other company I've ever worked in or visited, is that the entire company, everybody there is oriented towards the user experience. So everybody at Apple is functioning as a designer, whether that's their noted skill set or in their job title or not.
It is extremely refreshing to hear you say that you hire a lot of designers and that you see the difference between their work and other people's jobs. So I just wanted to ask, because you say that explaining UI design to someone is difficult, but still just the concept of design is very, very difficult because people don't understand, although it is mixed in absolutely everything that we do. It just makes process easier, more effective. So my question is, how do we get people who are not related to the industry to see that? Because we have our portfolios, we have our discussions, but we, in very little cases, get to speak with people outside the industry. So what do you think is an effective method to explain this to people, to get our work to be seen and to get recognition within the companies themselves? Because I see, today for the first time I heard that there is a chief technology officer. I didn't know that. So I think there should also be a chief design officer in enterprises, and I don't really know what should drive us to I don't know if we could demand this position, but how do we get recognized within basically everywhere?
There's a woman, Maria Guidas, who used to have a company here in San Francisco called Hot Studio, and then they got acquired by Facebook, and she recently became, I think, VP of Design at Autodesk. And Maria and a co-author wrote a book called The Rise of the CDO, the Chief Design Officer. So I think there's definitely an awareness at certain forward-thinking companies of chief creative officers, chief design officers. So I think that's happening at some level for some companies. Your other question is, because designers are often introverted. In fact, everyone I've ever met that's a designer is introverted, and they don't really, the industry doesn't really celebrate people out speaking about their work. They celebrate people making more, like just kind of the quiet designer sitting in their studio doing their thing. And there's not that many public figures of design. Like nobody really knows who came up with the iPhone, the software. Like unless somebody here just happens to know a couple of the folks inside Apple, I doubt anybody could name anybody who worked on the UI that you use all the time. And so partly as we start to see documentaries and books and stuff written about designers, I think you'll start to see more understanding that there are people behind these experiences. I think most consumers, when they walk into a store or they just have an experience, they just take it that it just sort of came down from the gods. It just arrived fully formed. You know, it's very hard to connect that Walt Disney was sitting on a park bench in LA when he had the idea for Disneyland, and that then he was able to go through some rigor and mechanism to create that experience you have today. It's hard to connect that was a human that made all those decisions. So until the public becomes more aware that there's people behind all this stuff, it's going to be a bit of a struggle, I think.
And to the other side of your question, saying how do you show your design and how do you talk to people outside the design? I think we, and this goes to designers, to engineers, to everybody. If you show your work, for example, if you show your portfolio and you leave your work to look how pretty it is, and look, do you like it or not? I think you might have a big risk there for the other person not to understand your work. If you show, instead of showing the work, if you talk about what was the impact of your work, or what was the purpose of you designing that, or what was the intention behind it, and what you make. Lisa this morning said about making choices that get reactions. If you talk about that, then you're going to show, beside what you see, I had an intention, and I made this impact on somebody else.
Show both the impact and the process.
Definitely. I think that's more important than just the visual thing, because we as humans, we're built to just see, and we have to work in seeing behind that.
So quick.
Hang on, he's got the mic back there.
How much do you think that design can be automated?
How much do you believe design can be automated? And Bob is going to answer this one.
So I'd have to look to nature for the only example of that system I can think of, which is the laws of physics. If you believe in evolution, belief's a weird word, but if you accept evolution as scientific fact, then you can look and you can say, geez, if you want a miracle, just take a bunch of hydrogen atoms, give them 14 billion years in the laws of physics, and you'll get a Sumatran tiger, which is pretty amazing. Turns out you'll get a couple of six-headed shrimps along the way, and you have no idea when you're going to get the tiger. So I think a lot of companies today, Google and Facebook and others, and Pinterest, we certainly do this, we have something close to trying to automate design, and that we're just running a bunch of experiments to see what takes hold with people. Unfortunately, I don't really know if you could think of any product that you would really consider breakthrough. There was a moment in time you said, wow, that was really revolutionarily different. I don't think you could take any product like that and say that came from a process of experimentation, any more than a work of art came from a process of experimentation. So I don't know. I guess I'm not too bullish on the idea that you're going to automate design at a fundamental level. And that gentleman's been waiting forever.
Okay. Thanks. Cheers to ex-Apple. 6 years of my life as well.
Yeah.
So,
I'll never get that back.
Yeah. I had hair. So as an employer, I'm curious of your comments about the new way of working. STEAM is great, and there's a lot of interest in design, but we have to design employment opportunities for people that don't necessarily want to stay in what are traditionally factory-style jobs or industrial revolution-style jobs. The way of working now is very, very different. It's a collection, it's a portfolio of income, et cetera, et cetera. How do you keep your employees on both the Globant side as well as a Pinterest side engaged and motivated and moving forward in today's world where time is really, really compressed, and we have a workforce that doesn't necessarily want to stay doing the same thing for 10 minutes, let alone 10 years.
Yep.
So the only way that we found, so in Globant we are a team of 250 designers distributed all over the world. As you can imagine, that the number alone and all the locations that we have impose a big difficulty in terms of, as you were saying, keep people motivated. The most effective way was to understand that the effort that you have to do in the team has to go more towards building an identity and a community within the company that goes beyond the project that they're currently working on. If you focus all of your efforts in exclusively the project, which is going to begin and end at some point, then there's this flavor of what else? But if you build a layer of a community, of an identity, of something that they can go back continuously and feed from other designers, from other members of that team, then that gives you a sense of endless. You know, it's all the time. And a few designers are here today, and we can certainly say that one of the things that we love from our team is that sense of community, that sense of having each other, building up on the knowledge of each other, helping each other, and having a purpose beside the task that you have to do that day. It's difficult, but it's the most rewarding thing that we have, I think.
Yeah, I have to say I don't know a whole bunch about their culture, but IDEO seems to have this pretty figured out. Whenever we interview people from IDEO, they just love IDEO. Like, it's so hard to get people out of there, and it's not about compensation, I can assure you. It's about constant learning and being part of the IDEO culture. And so there's a certain group of people that are really drawn to constant self-improvement and learning and new problem spaces. So again, I think some of Tim Brown's books from IDEO might help with that. At Pinterest, we sort of have a two-layer model of designers. So we have what we call lead designers, and then we have associate designers. And the lead designers are, they're in charge of a particular pillar of the product. So if you think about the core Pinterest product, there's activities around saving, around discovery, which includes search, and then around what we call do, which is how do you do things that you find on Pinterest, how do you make that dress, how do you bake that cake, et cetera. And so there's a lead designer over each one of these pillars, and there's 6 of the pillars. And then underneath those, there's a collection of associate designers. And the associate designers tend to be 2 to 7 years experience, and the lead designers tend to be more senior. And so for us, if the lead designers stay in the problem space for a couple of years, we're happy. And they enjoy being in the problem space for a few years because they start to understand it, and there's a richness and a deepness to it that they get to. The associate designers, because they're a little bit younger in their career and maybe working on more project and more sort of superficial features, we like to see them kind of move around every 6 months or so. And so that tends to help with the career development. We also do a lot of stuff outside the studio. So we do mind melds with other companies because it turns out a lot of the younger designers, maybe Pinterest is their first job, and they're curious, like, how do they do it over at Uber? How do they do it at Airbnb? And so we're fortunate to be in San Francisco because we can invite in those studios or we can go visit those spaces. And then we also, once a quarter, try to do some sort of inspirational offsite. So here we went to the Disney Family Museum or the Tesla factory, something that helps them stay connected to the broader community. And then we've been doing some lectures, actually, history of graphic design and things like that with some of the professors here from CCA, which has been fantastic. So I don't know if we have trouble keeping them engaged in the work. We have trouble. I think you have to take it on that you're creating an environment where they're going to be learning, constantly learning. You know, Apple Retail has this stat that if you, and I believe it's still true, if you join Apple Retail, they'll spend something like $60,000 training you in a 4-year career there, which is more than it would cost you to go to a state university. So part of that whole machinery of keeping you in Apple Retail is constantly educating you and helping you to learn and grow.
Okay, no, it's like why don't you keep that one out there, because I'm just going to. So I think this is a great segue into talking about the future of the social space. You were just mentioning Pinterest. We were discussing how, you know, if yesterday we can say was Facebook, and right now Twitter is kind of having its moment, and tomorrow may very well be Pinterest Day. So can you speak to that a little bit about the evolution of social, both of you? Yeah.
Yeah, actually the comment was less about the companies and kind of where the companies have been successful, a little bit more about how you represent yourself. So when you see somebody on Facebook, what they're mostly representing is their past. And their past could have been a year ago, it could have been yesterday, but it's mostly things that they've already completed. Twitter tends to be the now. This is what I'm thinking right now, this is what I'm doing right now. And at Pinterest, we tend to think about that as being your future. These are the things I hope to do. These are the trips I hope to make. These are the books I hope to read. It's sort of your aspirational future. So we do think there's an interesting continuum there. LinkedIn, I think, is an interesting spot here because what they mostly represent is your past. mostly talk about your education, your resume, projects you've worked on, but there's not a space in LinkedIn for you to really declare and talk about what you would like to become. You know, here's the profession I would like to have. And most employers are sort of looking for the thing that the employee wants to grow into. And a lot of times you're trying to separate yourself from your past. So I think a lot of these services sort of get stuck in a particular time zone for a user. And I was talking to somebody at lunch actually about how nobody's figured out how to represent somebody's complete lifespan in any of these services. It's gotten really balkanized. And I don't know how that resolves, because Facebook seems to be the big kid on the block right now. But it's telling that when you go to so many websites, there's just a bank of icons of how you could share this thing. You know, there's like some of these sites, there's like 10 different ways to share this stuff, which tells you something's got to consolidate, man. Like, we just can't have all these buttons on all these websites.
I was going to ask a question. Do you think that that's because of the nature of the service itself, for example, Twitter, because of the format and things like that, or because of our behavior, that we tend to see more the past than the future, and we tend to, you know, as a whole community, unfortunately, we tend to see, okay, we'll look back than the future. Do you think that has any impact on the products that we're making and how we're making those products?
So I'm relatively certain they don't know exactly what they're making when they make these products. So I think they're trying stuff, and we'll see what happens. I'm absolutely certain Mark Zuckerberg, sitting in his dorm room at Harvard, didn't conceive what we think of as Facebook today. I think it's just been sort of a wild journey. One thing I've noticed is if you look at the history of media, no old media ever goes away. No old media mechanism goes away. They get more specialized. Radio didn't kill newspapers. TV didn't kill radio. Movies didn't kill TV. The web didn't kill anything. Stuff gets a little bit smaller and it gets more specialized, but it doesn't go away. We still have fax machines, for goodness sakes, right? I mean, there's still all these medium types live on, and so they just become more specialized. And I think that's what you've seen with the evolution of Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and WeChat and Snapchat and Pinterest and LinkedIn. We've all been figuring it out over the last few years. You know, my kids, again, being 15 and 17, they're pretty savvy. Like, they kind of know in a way that they didn't in junior high. Like, and we were all kind of figured out when they were in junior high. But over the years, like, they've gotten really specific about what goes on Facebook and what goes on Twitter and what goes on Pinterest. So they've learned how to use those mediums for certain things.
This is your chance. Yes. Get it. Wait for the microphone, because it's hard for the people behind you to hear.
It'll get there.
Thank you.
Thanks. Given the illustrious talent on design on stage, I have a question on where you see the language of design going. You know, we had design, digital design, really trying to mimic real life, and then we went to flat design and material design and so on. Where do you guys see the future of design and how that connotes what you know, the user interface is and what it allows you to do, and just that whole, how does it allow people to interact with digital services, devices, products, etc.?
So beside styles of design, which is something that's going to keep, you know, it's going to keep changing, and there are going to be newer styles and different types of trends. I think that one of the things that I hope we can keep exploring is this idea, this notion of no interface in some way. If designing products that are aware enough or intelligent enough to simplify the friction, going back to a brief conversation that we were having, to simplify the friction that you have with those, and try to reduce the elements, the objects that we use, the tools that we use. Yesterday we were talking, Mike from Autodesk was talking about, you know, the whole work that you do, searching things and making things to finally make one important decision. I think that in design, I hope that in design we can understand that it's not our job, not necessarily our job, or not exclusively our job to design a button, you know, or to design an element or an object. We have to design interactions, and we have to design solutions in that way. So in terms of design from a visual perspective, I hope that we can explore through technology this concept of no interfaces, and if we and providing content in the right context, in that way, from more visual styles, going from maybe more transparent elements or maybe more flat elements. I don't know. I think that's changing so much, and we as Globant are a global company, and you see visual trends completely different in America as a continent as in Asia as well, and the influence of different textures and the influence of different even color palettes or different shapes. So those trends, I hope that we're going to reach into a point where we have some more global trends and define that. And at the same time, I hope that we can explore more frictionless products. I don't know if I answered your question. Sorry, man. Yeah.
So, just a slightly different take on some of that. So, my observation, and this is just an observation, I wasn't in any of these meetings at Apple, just as an Apple observer, if you just look at it, a lot of what you might think of as stylistic differences over the evolution of the iPhone in particular were actually, I believe, responses to technology differences. So the rise of skeuomorphism, the photorealism stuff in the UI, that actually really took off in the context of iPhone 4 and iPhone 4S when Apple was ahead of the game and we introduced Retina displays. And skeuomorphism looks incredible on Retina displays, and it looks like crap on lower resolution displays. So whether it was purposeful or not, that move helped to distinguish the iPhone hardware from its competitors on the Android side. And then if you fast forward a little bit to what was going on with the iPhone 5, there was a lot of pressure on Apple at the time to use larger screens. And one of the known dynamics of iOS 6 is that there was a lot of borders and buffering around that. So iOS 7 sort of famously spread everything to the edges, which is a nice way to make more use of a screen that everybody already thought was too small. And then when you get to later versions, you see animation coming in, blur effects, a lot of things that show off the power of the processor. And again, I think all these, again, whether they're conscious or not, and I suspect they were, but they were all ways to distinguish and do things in the software that the competition just couldn't do because of their hardware limitations. An earlier example would have been in OS 10. There was a point where they introduced alpha transparency. And when that alpha transparency came out, all the splash screens for software stopped being boxes and started being irregular shapes because they could show the screen behind the irregular shape, which is something you couldn't do on Windows. It's kind of a goofy little thing, but if you were paying attention, it made you realize that developer was in on the know and sort of knew that there was a benefit of some Apple technology. And then probably the first example I was aware of, if you go back to, I think it would have been Illustrator 88 or the version after 88 when they introduced type on a curve. And then if you go look at Communication Arts Design Annual that year, like every freaking thing was type on a curve. So you can almost track the history of graphic design in the last 2 decades, really, with the release cycle of Illustrator and Photoshop in particular. So I don't know what that means for where the UI is going. I just think if you look at the hardware differences and what you were talking about with invisible interfaces, that's really going to be dependent on the hardware getting fast enough, that the processor's getting fast enough that you can do that sort of stuff. And you see it even on set-top boxes, right? Like TiVo's UI has gotten much better and richer because they've been able to get much better processing power because the decline in price of chips.
There's one absolutely gorgeous quote from the head of Pixar that I think I'm going to have to tattoo on my forehead at some point in my life. It says that art defies technology and technology inspires art, which is beautiful. That whole flow of how one aspect is challenging the other one and completes and complements the other one. And I think it goes to what Bob was saying. We cannot think of design without the tools and the technologies that we have around. We should always think of design as using the tools and the technology to inspire us in many ways.
You certainly see the same thing with the history of music, the history of architecture. Like art is constantly pushing the boundaries of technology. They just go back and forth against each other.
So what are you both most surprised about that we're seeing now in design? You're both longtime observers of the scene. You've been engaged with it. Of the emergent trends now, what are you most surprised and motivated by?
So when we talked on the phone, one of the things I mentioned was I was sort of surprised by the App Store. Like the App Store came out, and I just didn't really think it was that big a deal. There's already the iTunes Store. Like it seems sort of like a logical extension. But the App Store, I think, is only 5 years old. The iPhone's 7 years old, and that's. I mean, Obama came into office in the United States after or before the iPhone came out. Like it's kind of nuts. Like if you think about how revolutionary it's happened and how much intellectual effort has gone into creating all these apps now. That's just a revolution by any measure. And I don't think anybody realized when they announced the App Store, which was maybe a 10-minute moment on a keynote, that the App Store was going to end up generating that amount of intellectual energy, much less economic energy. You know, right now the top 25 apps on the Apple App Store, 24 of them are owned by public companies. The only one who's not a public company is actually Pinterest. So there's a lot of money at the top of the App Store, not so much further down. But I don't think I realized what the App Store was going to be. So there's probably other answers to that question.
I'm going to try one. I'm extremely excited about the concept of ecosystems. And I think the App Store is one of them. And I'm very happy to see that we now are thinking about integrating different tools that are completely isolated, that traditionally were completely isolated, and that now we can integrate them and thinking about new services and new products that kind of in some way harvest the knowledge and the behavior of those others. I'm extremely excited, and we see this in Globant every day, that we can talk with our clients about not an app, but an ecosystem of things. And as a designer, that's thrilling because it allows me to think not just as one moment of the journey, but about the whole journey. And I can think about opportunities and risks. And I have to build a more professional team of designers, and I have to have another conversation. More strategic conversations. So I'm extremely excited to see that companies are getting to a level of maturity that allows them to talk about ecosystem and not exclusively about an instance of an application or something like that. You know, that's awesome.
And then to follow up on what Bob had said about this moment of impact and not being aware when the store was launched, how it was going to fuel human desire and human creativity. Are there any other aspects of sort of how you see people very creatively engaging with technologies that you feel are going to continue to explode or take on different manifestations? Do you see people using things in a way that's surprising or develop things in a way that...
You know, again, I think having teenagers, you see this stuff up close. It's just a different perspective. You know, Pinterest is built on top of Amazon Web Services. Turns out Adobe's Creative Cloud stuff is built on top of Amazon Web Services. The speed with which you can stand up a company like Airbnb or Pinterest or dozens of others is just unfathomable to what it was like trying to build a company like that 15 years ago. So I'm sort of blown away that we appear to have kind of gotten to this place where there's something like Lego pieces you can plug together to create products really quickly. I don't know if we have figured out all the great ideas yet. In fact, I'm certain we haven't. There's this thing that they'll talk about in Hollywood. Hollywood would make 40 blockbuster movies a year if they could get 40 scripts, but they can only get about 20 scripts. So there's sort of a lack of just great ideas. And I think that's part of what technology is struggling against right now. Again, you know, there's a lot of engineers. I mean, they can stand up. They did. They stood up like 10 fart apps really quickly. You know, they can do flashlight apps. They can do all sorts of stuff really quickly, but those big ideas are pretty few and far between. So I think, again, we're sort of seeing a lack of design thinking, not necessarily designers, but, you know, design thinking that's coming up with those unique ideas.
A while ago, I don't remember when, but I think a couple of years ago, there was a big flood in a part of Buenos Aires, in Argentina, in La Plata, actually. And a bunch of people created this kind of like a map to visualize the different areas of the flood. The same happened with some shortage of energy and where the energy was low, and you could actually take action and go and help people in the different areas, just visualizing. It was a very open source platform, and this was things that like 2 people made, you know, and it was feeding from the content that everybody was adding and things like that. When I see technology being used that way, I'm extremely hopeful. I think it's amazing to see what very easy tools, without even going to Oculus or amazing technologies and things that are out there that you see in the labs that we have, in the playground that we have in our offices. You see Glovers playing with those technology, and you cannot even believe what they're doing, or very silly things as well. But when you see the technology and the impact that we can have in our communities and with each other with such a simple tools, and which so open resource things, with just a willingness to do it and just learning a few things and just putting it out there, I think that's awesome. Because at the end of the day, you go back to thinking, well, maybe we are compassionate. Maybe we want to help each other. Maybe that's what we have to. Maybe that's the default. We just have to believe that we want to do that, and then put the resources out there and do it, and just do it, and you'll see things like that are amazing, and that help lives, and that's awesome.
So, can you hear me? Okay. Yes, so, with the ever-changing technology and ecosystem that's changing around us, my question is, how do you define the designer of the future? So what kind, because when HCI was still very new, it was looked at as a person from cognitive background or art background or similar skills, but that's gone from there to all sorts of personas, computer graphics people, animators. Everybody fits into designer's role, coding, everything. So how do you look at that persona?
So the other, I'll take this one. So the other day I was talking with a colleague, and I think one of the basic things that we have to assume that our designers will always have to be are observers of behavior. That's never going to change. We have to observe behavior, and we have to be extremely good at identifying those patterns in behavior and gathering insight from those behaviors. Because even things as interfaces may change. Maybe tomorrow we're just going to, all of our products are going to be biological, and we're just going to, I don't know, feel things, and there's not going to be an interface. I'm just, we're not even closer, but suppose that's it, and maybe the interface design skill is not going to be needed, but the behavior observation is going to be always needed. You're always going to have to observe an organism, observe something, and gather insight from that. So I think the designer of the future is going to have to be, and the designer of today has to be extremely aware of the choices they make to see the reactions that they're going to take, quoting Lisa this morning. I think that we have to think about more the system of service and products, and not exclusively about the visual representation. We need to think that the visual, that the experience, that the service is a part of it all, and we should not just think of our design discipline or engineering discipline as that thing. We should observe behavior and base our decisions on evidence of behavior.
Yeah, so at Pinterest, as with most companies, we have portfolio review as part of the interview process, and it turned out that we never made an offer to somebody who had a bad portfolio review, and we never failed to make an offer to somebody who had a great portfolio review. So as much as I hate to say it was a tryout, it turned out it was a tryout. And so you kind of had this 1 hour when that was your moment to see if you were going to make the cut. And for a long time, we used a tool called Greenhouse to enter feedback on how people did on the portfolio review. And for a long time, we just had inherited the rating system they used in engineering interviews, which turned out to have absolutely no relevance to the portfolio review. And so in sort of a moment of flash, I said, we should change that and come up with some different parameters. And so we did a working session around it. We came up with 15 different parameters that we rate portfolio reviews on. 5 of them are around specific design technical skills, so visual design, typography, motion, interaction design, information architecture. And those are all technical skills, right? And those are things that you can learn in lots of different ways. So we rate people on those 5 things. But then there's also 5 qualities around collaboration and 5 around communication. And the ones around collaboration were how you deal with conflicts, how you interact with other designers, how you interact with PMs, how you interact with engineers. And the communication skills were like storytelling, time management, ability to move the conversation forward. So when I think about the designer of the future compared to the people I knew that were designing 20 years ago, 20 years ago, if you were a designer, you were sitting in your cube or maybe in an office and you were kind of on your own and the stuff kind of came out fully formed, and maybe if the engineers were lucky, you did an hour a week with them. That's not really how it rolls now. You're definitely, a cell in a bigger organism, and so a lot of the design skills that we look for now are more communication skills, and ultimately designers are professional communicators. So you have to be able to communicate at a really professional level. So I think that's been a big shift, probably just in the last 5 years. Again, I think if you look at Silicon Valley, it might be that Apple's product culture is the thing that everybody follows, but it's really Google's development culture that is the thing that drives almost every company in Silicon Valley. The quarterly planning process called OKRs, the experimentation culture, the way they think about the interaction of engineering, PM, and design. Almost every company is modeled after Google. Nobody's modeled after Apple.
I have a question. What we see, traditionally, you look at the way design used to work, it was always about features, specifications, performance, design for quality, design for manufacturing. These are the things that drove the way we design things. Now, with the transition to the digital journey, digital experiences, where the user experiences becomes the focus of the product or the service, how do you see this impacting where we actually design for UX, designing for the user, designing for the experience versus designing for the product? The product becomes kind of a secondary thing or the vehicle for the experience.
We're trying to decide. It changes everything. I hope it changes everything. When you focus on a, let's call it user, when you focus on a person, it defines the very definition of your product, and maybe you need to come up with new services, and maybe you need to come up with, we need to radically change your product. Whilst when you're just designing, when you want to keep a product alive without looking at your user, there's so much you can do, and you just cross your finger, they're still relevant, whilst when you look at the behavior and you kind of drive from that, then you have more chances to stay relevant, because relevancy comes from the context and being aware of what's happening all around you and driving that into nutritional insight is what I call it. Some sort of insight that actually makes you grow and not just, it's super interesting and that's it. But it really changes everything, and it has to change, and it changes, and I'm assuming that your question comes from an environment when that didn't happen, and then has to change into something that it changes the very core of the organization as well. It has to change. Otherwise, just doing halfway, it's not gonna, it's not gonna be very sustainable.
So I'm actually getting the cue. I got the nod. So we can continue the conversation offline off the stage. It's been a fantastic time. I wanted to thank Bob and Emmy for a wonderful and engaging journey across all of these ideas. Thank you so much. Yeah, well done. And to everybody who participated, I also want to thank our fantastic partners from Globant. We planned this event with them. It's their event. Really, we're partners, but they put so much work into this. Particularly, Julia and Andres have been fantastic to work with, so I want to thank Globant for everything. So thank you.